If you're speaking, you're still on mute.
Now, do you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So thanking everyone for joining today. Very grateful to Professor Angus Nurse for this opportunity to share my work given the ongoing atrocities in Gaza. Thankful to all of you for caring about Palestine and for being here today. Amid myriad crimes against humans and non-humans in Palestine and elsewhere, our conscience is tested and we have a choice every day to care or not care, to stay silent or to challenge crime. So many, including scholars and activists who built careers of supposedly fighting injustice, have chosen to keep their minds, souls, and mouths shut. So thank you for choosing to feel the suffering of others. I know some of the ones here today, and I'm moved by seeing you, how you challenge crime and criminals every day. I'm sharing with you today a research I've been working on every day for the past year and a half on this genocide's invisible victims, non-human animals in nature. A brief breakdown of what I'll be covering today. I begin with a context, a century of crime in Palestine, and a few details on my relation personally and professionally to this context. Next, I cover some basics on the ongoing genocide and ecocide in Gaza to show its impact on non-humans and on nature. I first document crimes and harms against animals. Hundreds of thousands of wild and domesticated animals have been killed, injured, maimed, displaced, starved. Next, I show how animals also became complicit in war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically how Israel has weaponized dogs to torture, terrorize, injure, and rape Palestinians. In other contexts too, animals are turned into both combatants and victims amid colonizers' erasure of the indigenous. Next, I cover the impact on humans and non-humans of toxicity from explosives, the damage to plants and soil, and the burden of greenhouse gas emissions. The systematic destruction of the natural and built environment and the contamination with toxic substances of the soil, air, and water have turned Gaza into a wasteland which can no longer sustain life. And it is here that I examine the lasting ties between mass atrocity and epigenetics. Next, I discuss the role of the military-industrial complex, the merchants of death driving both genocide and ecocide. Finally, I discuss the paralysis of international law and our role in confronting impunity and outsourcing, which are key features of crimes in Palestine. I don't have presentation slides. I'll just be following my notes. My talk is about a half hour, followed by a half-hour discussion with you. And I'm now leaving my contact details in the chat box. I would gladly stay in touch with all of you and send you my full article if you are interested. Okay, so we start with a bit of a context, a century of crime in Palestine. So for the past century, Palestinians have been subjected to some of the worst crimes in modern history, all tolerated by international law and by global fora, supposedly in charge of international peace and justice. Palestinian life remains marked by a few significant factors, intersecting structures. First, settler extractive colonialism, we would say the last active colonial project in the world, the longest illegal military occupation in modern times, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, routine war crimes, crimes against humanity, and human rights violations, a deliberately failed and failing so-called peace process, third-party complicity from the US's military and diplomatic role in sustaining these crimes to the UN's failure to challenge the crimes, as well as the corporate profit derived from war, occupation, and annexation. And of course, we also have Israel's pervasive culture of complicity and unseeing others is suffering. All these layers of crime bring Palestinian life closer to a slow death. A bit about myself too. My academic and civic work over the past 20 years is informed by the encounters my Palestinian and Romanian parents and grandparents have had with war, occupation, colonialism, and authoritarianism. My father's family is from Gaza, some still living there. My grandparents lived and died as refugees in Gaza. They are from Sawafir, a village turned into the Moshav Shafir, which is now part of Israel. Their land and home were stolen in 1948, which is what happened to almost 1 million Palestinians, starting with the beginning of the 20th century and culminating with the 48 war. My father, who is now dead, was among the many Palestinian political prisoners imprisoned and tortured by Israel during the first Intifada. My younger brothers, sister, and cousins all have survived multiple genocidal wars, and other relatives have lost their home, health, and some also lives from Israel's assaults. So moving to the ongoing genocide and ecocide in Gaza. Israel's genocidal and ecocidal assault on Gaza is among the worst contemporary atrocities. A live-streamed war of annihilation, which has fractured the lives of 2.1 million people, from which animals and nature have not been spared. To anyone familiar with Palestine, this genocide is not unexpected. It's only a culmination of the crimes routine over the past century. The situation is volatile and many details are not available, given the relentless murder of locals and of journalists. And of course, also the constant internet and electricity cuts and other factors which hinder reporting. So the atrocities I'm discussing today are a fraction of the ongoing horrors. So we start with Hamas's massacre on the 7th of October 2023, which left about 1,200 Israelis killed and 251 taken hostage. Since then, Israel has destroyed every single aspect of life in the Gaza Strip, as documented by the latest report of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Israel has killed over 60,000 people, 60% of whom are women, children, and elderly. It has injured and maimed over 145,000 people, with tens of thousands still missing, probably trapped under the rubble, some abducted by Israel, tortured, imprisoned, and so on. It has displaced 2 million people, nearly the entire population of Gaza, and destroyed or damaged 92% of housing units, 88% of commerce and industry entities, and 81% of the road network. The housing, medical, sanitation, and food infrastructure have been destroyed, creating a humanitarian crisis of apocalyptic proportions, with millions of people homeless, humans and non-humans starving to death, children's limbs amputated without anesthetic, and millions of cases of infectious diseases. In an 827-page report, Forensic Architecture noted last year, quote, "The patterns we've observed concerning Israel's military conduct in Gaza indicate a systematic and organized campaign to destroy life, conditions necessary for life, and life-sustaining infrastructure." The death toll above, about 60,000 people, is an undercount, as documented by multiple studies over the past year. By now, probably between 200,000 and 300,000 people have been killed, if we include also indirect deaths caused by the genocidal conditions imposed on Gaza, which include severe and deliberate shortages of food and clean water, the destruction of the healthcare and sanitation infrastructure, which contributed to deaths from starvation, dehydration, untreated or poorly treated war injuries, chronic illnesses, infectious diseases, and many other factors. Nature and non-human animals have not been spared from these atrocities. The tons of bombs dropped on Gaza and the destructive ground operations have taken the life of countless animals and have destroyed the natural and built environment, which sustained the lives of humans and non-humans. However, these crimes against nature and animals remain typically outside mainstream news and studies, and that's why I try to document the invisible victims of the genocide. Because war doesn't just break human lives, it also causes premature death and protracted suffering to sentient non-human animals. It also destroys plants and microorganisms, all in symbiotic relations. impacting ecosystems for generations to come. This environmental cost is, however, neglected. So I moved to the first section of my paper, which covers crimes and harms against non-human animals. Just like humans, non-humans in Gaza have been suffering for now 663 days from murder, horrific injuries, untreated illnesses, infections, hunger, dehydration, homelessness, terror, and so on. First, I document how non-human animals have been and are being harmed. It's important to note here that amid war, the animals, and particularly animals with complex sentience, blown to pieces, left to die in agony under the rubble, or dying from starvation, from dehydration, from injuries, from infections. They are not unlike us. They also suffer physically and psychologically. They feel fear, they feel pain, hunger, thirst, cold, heat, and so on. So to me, their suffering is no less of a crime than the unnecessary and extreme suffering of human beings. While we lack precise numbers, we can safely assume that hundreds of thousands to millions of wild and domesticated animals have been killed, injured, maimed, and displaced. And just to illustrate this, according to a Food and Agriculture Organization report, only by spring 2024, so almost 1.5 years ago, 95% of Gaza's cattle had died, and fewer than 43% of sheep and 37% of goats were still alive. And the worst impacted was the poultry sector, with about only 1% of birds left alive. Animals used for sports also became collateral damage. By spring 2024, 90% of horses in equestrian clubs in Gaza had been killed, while the rest went missing. The assessments we have so far of the war's toll on animals only include owned animals. So the number of impacted homeless animals and wild animals is difficult to approximate. Since across many commercial sectors, most animals had been killed by mid-2024, and now the impact of the war on animals is immense. And of course, if we see complete impunity when it comes to the human victims of the war, non-humans matter even less. The killing of animals is not only normalized when they become collateral damage during war, but their killing is legal even when it's intentional and done during times of peace, as shown by murderous yet legal sectors like industrial animal farming and wildlife trade, which kill billions of animals annually. Another facet of non-human suffering here is captivity. My prior research has documented the severe physical and psychological impact of captivity on sentient non-humans, and numerous legal, legislative, and civic initiatives challenging it. While conventional forms of captivity, such as factory farms, zoos, circuses, labs, menageries, and so on, are often condemned, we also come across forms of captivity which are not seen as unethical. And one atypical form here is what I call well-meaning captivity, rescued animals trapped in shelters, in sanctuaries, or homes. Usually we ignore their suffering. But animals trapped in wars and in natural or man-made disasters also experience an atypical form of captivity, because billions of animals cannot escape bombardment, floods, fires, and other catastrophic conditions because they are confined or restrained or immobilized. And that applies here because in Gaza, many animals were trapped under the rubble. Others were stuck, chained, or tied. They were confined in crates, in stalls, in cages amid bombardment. So whether we think of companion animals captive in collapsed homes, or domesticated animals raised for food, captive in farms, or wild animals captive in zoos, they all found themselves unable to move, with their human caretakers dead, injured, displaced, so no one to release and care for them. Though much has been written on animals in wars and disasters, animal captivity in such contexts remains neglected. Gaza is often described as the largest open-air prison, or as Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling once called it, the world's largest concentration camp. And that's important because here everyone, human and non-human, is captive due to the blockade enforced by Israel and Egypt for the past 18 years, combined with constant genocidal assaults. So amid atrocities, people and animals in Gaza have no escape. Captivity amid war means a slow and painful death. Though the intrinsic value of non-humans should be tied to moral and legal rights, even if we look at them instrumentally, their killing is detrimental because it leads to resource strain, and that here manifests in the famine we've seen for the past year, deliberately inflicted by Israel, affecting every human and non-human animal in Gaza. And this has led to heartbreaking situations like numerous people and animals starving to death, children feeding hungry kittens instead of keeping for themselves the little food available, or grim scenes like children and stray cats and dogs all scavenging through trash. Alongside the famine in Yemen, the situation in Gaza is the worst humanitarian crisis in recent decades. 100% of Gazans face high level of acute food insecurity, with 1 million people already facing emergency levels of food insecurity and almost 500,000 facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity, and 93% of households experiencing water insecurity. So we can assume that the same applies to non-human animals, even worse, of course. And significant to note here is also the sinister decoupling we witness. For many Israelis, human rights seem totally disconnected from non-human rights. It's not just the human rights of the in-group valued over those of the out-group, but we also often see animal rights valued more than and obfuscating human rights. As many of you know, Israel is one of the world's vegan capitals with a growing animal rights movement, which creates this veneer of ethics and compassion. But some of the same Israelis prizing animal rights have no empathy for Palestinian humans and non-humans blown to pieces or starved to death. My next section covers animals as combatants or victims. So another facet of animal abuse here is how animals are being weaponized amid war and colonization. Specifically, Israel has used dogs to torture, terrorize, injure, and rape Palestinians, with multiple cases of dogs mauling Gazans, alive and dead, including women, children, and elderly. And this is, of course, not new. Israel has for decades systematically used military dogs to brutalize Palestinians in prisons or during home invasions, with hundreds of horrific cases documented. An investigation by the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations indicates some of the dogs used for crimes in Gaza are imported from the Netherlands, from companies which have supplied the Israeli military for decades. Recently, this organization, alongside 9 other Palestinian and Dutch NGOs, have sued the Netherlands over its role in facilitating Israel's violations of international law. And one of the demands in the case was the Netherlands halting exports of military dogs to Israel. So animals become complicit against their will in war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is not new. For millennia, animals have been involved in hostilities, used as, for instance, means of transport, horses, mules, camels, elephants, oxen, and so on, of communication or espionage. Pigeons, for instance, of reconnaissance, dogs, rats, sea lions, dolphins, and so on, or directly engaged in combat, most commonly dogs. Though sometimes they become combatants or aggressors, ultimately they are victims due to their lack of consent. Studies have discussed animals as combatants and prisoners of war, and though this status is not recognized under international humanitarian law, so I see the weaponization of animals amid genocide as animal cruelty. The next section covers toxicity from explosives. So another side of environmental crime here is the chemical dimension. Huge amounts of hazardous substances have contaminated the Gaza Strip, harming humans and non-humans for generations. Only from October 2023 to early April 2024, Israel had dropped over 75,000 tons of explosives on Gaza, the equivalent of 6 nuclear bombs. The explosives dropped on Gaza exceed the World War II bombings of Dresden, Hamburg, and London combined. Hundreds of thousands of homes, hospitals, mosques, schools, factories have been turned to rubble. And so far, at least 92% of housing units, 88% of entities in commerce and industry, and 81% of roads have been damaged or destroyed. With the war now in its 21st month, The amount of explosive used is immense, which has caused massive killing, injuries, maiming, destruction, and displacement, and will be harming beings, humans, animals, plants, and microorganisms for decades to come. And significant here is that besides the release of toxic chemicals in the weapons themselves, the destruction of residential buildings can also release hazardous substances such as asbestos, which can cause fatal conditions like asbestosis, mesothelioma, lung cancer, and so on. It can also release lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, chromium, thallium, formaldehyde, phthalates, flame retardants, and so on. The bombing of industrial facilities comes with additional risks given the large quantities of hazardous substances stored. The debris from destroyed infrastructure and from the weapon itself harms humans and non-humans. And here, like we think of explosive munitions, they typically contain lead, antimony, uranium, DNT, TNT, RDX, HMX, and many other substances which I cannot even pronounce with toxic environmental effects. We also add radioactive chemical and biological waste from the production of weapons of mass destruction. We all know that Israel has, although it doesn't confirm or deny, it does have nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. The toxic substances released by weapons and ruined infrastructure also harm microorganisms in the soil, which are vital for agriculture. And my next section covers that, the damage to plants and soil. By early spring 2024, half of tree cover and farmland in Gaza had been destroyed by bombardment and bulldozing. Many other trees were cut by Gazans to use for heating and cooking, given the severe shortages of fuel. The massive destruction of trees affects the air quality. Of course, it also affects birds who have lost their homes. And this is not new. Trees have been for decades victims of Israel's colonialism and occupation. For instance, from 1967 to 2013, over 800,000 Palestinian olive trees had been uprooted by Israeli authorities, adding the over 100,000 olive trees uprooted, burned, or chemically poisoned by Israeli settlers only from 2010 to 2020. The practice continues to this day. As of April 2025, 83% of croplands in Gaza, 83% of agricultural wells, and 71% of greenhouses had been damaged, and 72% of the fishing fleet destroyed, with now less than 5% of cropland available for cultivation. The soil in Gaza was already poisoned from prior wars, as well as from Israel's repeated aerial spraying of chemicals like glyphosate, oxyfluorophane, and DCMU or DRON, all known human carcinogens with a wide range of toxic effects on non-human animals too, at high concentrations, which have damaged farmlands, impacted plants, animals, humans, and microorganisms. Like defoliants used in Vietnam, this is a form of herbicidal warfare as determined in a report by Forensic Architecture in 2019. Gaza has been turned into a toxic wasteland, affecting humans, non-humans, and nature for generations to come. My next section covers harm from greenhouse gas emissions. So besides killing non-humans, the production, transport, use, and disposal of weaponry cause pollution to the air, water, and land, harming entire ecosystems. Militaries are among the largest consumers of fuel globally, their environmental footprint going way beyond 100 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually. A recent study by Nymark and colleagues document that, quote, the projected emissions from 15 months of direct war activities were greater than the annual emissions of 36 individual countries and territories, with the total carbon emissions due to direct war activities amounting to nearly 1.9 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and emissions from reconstructing destroyed buildings and roads and debris removal nearing 30 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The total figure from this war, including war activities, pre-war activities, and post-war activities, surpasses the individual annual emissions of over 102 countries. The effects of environmental destruction from air, water, and soil pollution to the killing of plants and animals are of course worst felt in densely populated areas. Even before the war, Gaza was one of the most densely populated places on Earth, 365 square kilometers and 2.1 million inhabitants. squeezed by the military operations now in 15% of the land. Now each person inhabits only about 24 square meters, which is the size of a typical Guantanamo prison cell. Gazans have no way out and no immediate prospects of going back to the rest of the strip, given estimations that it will take decades to clean up the rubble and rebuild. A UN report notes that in a best-case scenario, Gaza could be rebuilt by 2040, but given the pacing in prior wars, rebuilding may take 80 years. And in January this year, it was estimated that only the over 50 million tons of debris in Gaza could take up to 20 years to remove. And another report notes that once the ceasefire is reached, a return to 2007-2022 growth trend would imply that it would take Gaza 350 years just to restore GDP to its level in 2022. So the destruction of the natural and built environment breaks human and non-human lives for generations. And here I have a short section in my paper on mass atrocity and epigenetics. In sites of mass atrocity, like Gaza, I believe the dead are the lucky ones because they escaped. However, survivors continue to endure catastrophic conditions and are left with physical and psychological traumas, many which will never heal. But those here and now who are left in the abyss are not the only victims. Future generations of humans and non-humans will face the many long-term consequences of this genocidal and ecocidal war. The crimes detailed so far are likely to cause epigenetic changes in humans, animals, plants, and possibly microorganisms, all shook by the massive trauma and toxicity. Many studies have documented epigenetic alterations in individuals exposed to chronic stressors, such as psychological trauma, exposure to toxic substances, impoverished diets, extreme heat or cold, and also the transgenerational transmission of some of these epigenetic changes. The long-lasting psychological and physical effects of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity have been covered in the vast literature on intergenerational trauma. And of course, some of the epigenetic changes caused by chronic stressors are also documented in many non-human animals. But the intergenerational impact of mass atrocity on animals, plants, and ecosystems is not very well understood. Given the colossal scale of suffering and destruction, there's no return to pre-war normality. All beings in Gaza will probably develop epigenetic changes in responses to the trauma and damage suffered. My next section covers the merchants of death driving genocide and ecocide. I believe the atrocities in Gaza are a sordid reminder of how the military-industrial complex drives genocide and ecocide. As we all know, violence brings immense profits to weapons corporations. Hence, reasons for violence need to be intermittently fabricated. And significant here is that weapons don't just harm humans. Advanced technologies of violence are also used to murder animals. They allow the colossal scale and efficiency of killing, and they distance physically and psychologically the killer from the killed. For instance, domestic and wild animals are massacred with firearms, so captive bolts, pistols, electrical killing and stunning machines, carbon dioxide chambers. All are technologies developed and perfected for murder. The tools made for killing humans and non-humans are synergistic and significant here, given the sophistication of the Israeli military and the massive military support from the US. As Francesca Albanese writes in her latest report, Israel has created the quote economy of genocide. And this shows that the militarized violence has been at the core of the Israeli state since its inception, and quote, the military-industrial complex has become the economic backbone of the state. Ever-evolving technologies of killing, destruction, surveillance, and carcerality are developed by Israeli companies and exported globally as field-tested, of course, in Palestinian humans and non-humans. And many Israeli tech companies operating in unrelated fields are actually often rooted in military infrastructure and agendas. Economic profit guides violence. My penultimate section covers environmental crimes and the paralysis of international law. And here I note that horrific is not just the scale and duration of destruction in Gaza, and also in general, the duration of atrocities in Palestine for almost a century, but also the paralysis of international law. Countless UN General Assembly and Security Council resolution recognizing Israel's crimes have been systematically ignored over the decades. Hundreds of pages of evidence on Israel's crimes have been sitting on the desks of ICC prosecutors for a decade now. Gaza attests to the law's failure to prevent, halt, and repair mass atrocity. The war on Gaza triggered historical developments proving the inadequacy of international humanitarian criminal law. I think I will have to skip those because I don't have much time left. I would gladly share with you my paper to read in detail this section. I believe legal commentary is redundant because Israel has systematically violated for decades with impunity the most basic aspects of human rights law, humanitarian law, and criminal law. So although I document many legal aspects of what's now going on in Gaza, they are actually irrelevant. So the last section covers confronting impunity and outsourcing. I believe a core feature of crimes against humans and non-humans in Palestine is the lack of criminal accountability and the outsourcing of financial responsibility. That is the case, of course, with nearly all genocides, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Historically, we've seen that prosecutions and reparations have been exceptional, and even when some transitional justice measures were implemented, the punitive and reparative measures were limited and shallow. If there's hardly any repair for crimes against humans, of course, we see non-humans in nature much lower on conventional hierarchies of victimhood, rarely enjoying any accountability. For decades, Israel has massacred, injured, maimed, tortured, displaced humans and animals, and destroyed irreversibly, in many cases, significant portions of the natural and built environment. Yet, it's never the criminals paying for the damage. Billions of aid to Gaza for food, for healthcare, for rebuilding homes and infrastructure typically come from individual donors from all over the world and from a few countries, in both cases individuals and governments who never contributed anything to the atrocities. Over the past 21 months of relentless genocidal and ecocidal operations, numerous initiatives by foreigners and by Palestinians alike have tried to support survivors. And I will just give you one inspiring example. In response to the severe ongoing famine affecting every human and animal in Gaza, the Gaza Soup Kitchen, a grassroots project started by a family in Gaza feeding over 3,000 people daily for the past year, has raised for food supplies over $4 million on a crowdfunding platform from people over the world. Similarly, animals in Gaza have been benefited from some limited crowdfunding initiatives with money donated for food and veterinary care. While empathy and solidarity matter here, they cannot compensate for the lack of criminal and financial accountability enjoyed by perpetrators. I believe we all can and should help survivors in Gaza and elsewhere by donating to grassroots initiatives, joining protests, signing petitions, boycotting businesses which profit of Israel's colonization, occupation, and war, talking in person and online about these crimes, and so on. Yet our compassion also feeds the normalization of impunity. So given the scale and the severity of crimes against humans and non-humans globally and their deep-rooted tie to profit, criminalization is imperative, otherwise diplomacy and civic solidarity only offer symptomatic relief. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for caring about Gaza, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks very much for an excellent and riveting, if that's the right word, talk. I'll just stop the recording and then I will throw it open to questions. And I think I see Stephen has his hand up.
Okay, first, can you hear me?